as Trump pushes for interest rate cuts, you've noted that money supply growth has been rising every month for nearly 7 to 8 consecutive months now. And so I want to talk about the increase in money supply in the context of the value of the US dollar. I know many of my viewers are very interested in this particular topic. As of early May, the US dollar has experienced a notable decline in value against a basket of major currencies. More specifically, there is a decrease of nearly 9% since early January, since Trump returned to office. This downturn is attributed, from what I understand, to factors such as shifting tariff policies, this flip-flopping, economic uncertainties, and of course concerns over U.S. fiscal outlook, given that there is the rising deficit spending and national debt is completely out of control. So if the Fed does pursue lower interest rate policy, would it not lower the value of the U.S. dollar even more in the future?
Yes, it would. Lower interest rate policy tends to drive a more devalued dollar. And that's important to international trade in a variety of ways and to the international value of the dollar. I think one thing to keep in mind is that Trump is obsessed with exports, right? He's got this idea that he wants fewer imports and more exports. Well, an easy way to drive more exports is to make the dollar cheaper. And they were talking about a new Fed, or I suppose a new Trump policy of a cheaper dollar. And they were even kind of speculating that he was going to meet with a bunch of world leaders at Mar-a-Lago, and they were going to all agree that they were going to cheapen the dollar. And they were going to call it the Mar-a-Lago Accords. And this was meant to mirror the Plaza Accords from the mid-1980s, where they had explicitly wanted to cheapen the dollar in order to encourage more exports, more U.S. exports, more foreign imports. Or fewer foreign imports. And the reason for that, right, is if you're a foreigner and the dollar's real expensive, it's harder to buy dollars so that you can buy more American goods. So if you're cheapening the dollar, more people can get their hands on dollars and buy more American stuff. And in spite of Volcker, Paul Volcker, right, famously raised interest rates up over 20%. And this helped destroy the inflationary cycle that was occurring in the early 1980s. And so Volcker, since then, has gotten this reputation as a hard money guy. But Volcker was very much in favor of the Plaza Accord. Under Reagan, he was more proof of collusion between the White House and the central bank, in spite of all these myths about Fed independence. The Fed and the White House worked together to cheapen the dollar under the Plaza Accord. So the question was, well, can we drive more exports then by cheapening the dollar with these Mar-a-Lago Accords? So the administration may be very, very interested in that, in a cheaper dollar policy, just to drive more exports so that foreigners can get their hands on more dollars and buy more American stuff. So that's something to always keep in mind. And he may also want cheaper dollars. Well, I wouldn't say it as wanting cheaper dollars, but more just wanting low interest rate policy, not for the sake of stimulus to the economy, but for the sake of keeping U.S. debt cheap. And that was something that was going on in the 1980s as well, right? Is that the U.S. had issued massive amounts of new debt during the military buildup under Reagan in the mid-80s, and then they were suddenly realizing that, well, we just can't keep paying these sorts of interest on the federal debt. And so there was an effort then to bring down interest rates, which also brings along a cheaper dollar. And so that may be going on now as well as that, as the U.S. is now barreling toward 38 trillion in the national debt. How can it keep paying that sort of interest on that? And one way to help deal with that is to cheapen the dollar. And certainly there's no reason to believe that the dollar is getting more expensive. As you point out, right, the dollar supply, the money supply, just keeps getting bigger. And this is reflected in what we discussed, right? They're not unloading their portfolio, which has a deflationary effect. So they're not doing that. They're holding interest rates steady. And commercial banking continues to also add more liquidity into the economy through its own policies. And so we're seeing then more dollars created. And the US dollar amount, which I think is probably about 19 trillion at the moment in terms of the actual money supply, it's been going up in recent months. It came down from those super high levels that it had encountered during 2002, 2003, or rather 2022, 2023, and also 2021, I believe. It had come down from that a little bit, but it's still way above trend. In order to get back to the pre-COVID trend, you would have to knock off like another 5 trillion at least from the overall total money supply. So we're still above trend on total money supply. We're still looking at a government that is motivated toward a cheaper dollar for two reasons. That is more exports and also cheaper federal debt. So there's all sorts of different things we need to take into account. So we just shouldn't be surprised if we see that the policy is toward a cheaper dollar, even if it does make the dollar less valued internationally. I mean, they probably know that they got a long way to go to destroy the dollar when you consider what other central banks are doing, right? China is cheapening the yuan. The European Central Bank is not doing itself any favors. It's already cutting its interest rate. Funnily, hilariously, Trump was actually, one of the times that he was criticizing Powell for being too late and doing too little in terms of lowering interest rates. He said Powell should be more like the European Central Bank, which is a terrible idea. But that was Trump's suggestion. Be more like Europe, which is really not any advice that you should be giving any central banker right now. But that was something he said. And so as long as we know that the central bank of Europe continues to devalue its own currency, China's doing that, nobody else is really turning toward hard money. The Americans probably get away with cheapening their dollar a bit for those other purposes that we just mentioned. So sure, that's probably a policy. They just want to make sure that they don't do anything that's really fatal to the dollar. But I think that's not something that's going to happen anytime soon when you compare it to other currencies.
Tariffs might have something to do with the low interest rate policy push as well. When do you think the effects of tariffs would kick in? And do you think that we'll see more of this renewed push toward easy money as prices start to increase as the result of tariffs and perhaps even lower supply of those goods, since we already see that shipments are actually decreasing and the number of ships coming into the United States is much, much lower. So what's your take on this?
Yes, we're likely to see rising prices if the tariffs as stated stay in place, right? Part of the policy is that it's totally chaotic, right? And I don't know what the tariffs are going to be next week versus what they were last week because the policy is constantly changing. This, by the way, is one of the problems of giving a single person total control over tax policy, right? Rather than having it go through some sort of like actual legal process in Congress. We're just going to have one guy just kind of decide on whims what the tariff policy is. So that creates a ton of uncertainty. And you can see how the Fed probably isn't lying when they say, yeah, we've got a lot of uncertainty we're not sure about. And that is one factor. But as you note, right, even if demand stays the same and supply goes down because we've got fewer shipments of stuff we want, stuff we need coming in, well, that's going to cause rising prices because you're going to have the same number of dollars chasing a lessening amount of goods that are available. So yeah, you'll see prices go up then, and you'll see the cost of living go up in that case. And then you could see real ham-fistedly, well, you'll definitely see Trump then. If you do see the economy slow in that way and you see the cost of living go up, Trump, because he doesn't seem to understand monetary policy, or he doesn't care, maybe, I don't know, he'll start calling for stimulus and he'll want lower interest rates. He'll want some sort of stimulus just to at least create the impression that the economy is heating up and that things are getting better. But that would just make the situation worse because you've got rising prices to then engage in lower interest rate policy, and monetary inflation would then just drive up prices even more. And you could actually enter a really unfortunate downward spiral in that case. But all the short-term thinking would just be, stimulate the economy with lower interest rates and that'll solve the problem. Really, of course, the real solution to the problem would be just get out of people's lives. If you really want tariffs, then just pick 10% tariff rate on all goods coming into the country, because they keep talking about how they want revenue from tariffs. Fine, great. Just pick a flat rate, impose it on everything everywhere. Everybody will know. The economy could then adjust to that. That would still reduce the amount at which people could import goods and services because prices would be higher. But 10% is a lot better than 80% or 145%, like these bizarre tariffs that he's putting on Chinese goods and stuff. And because we us free traders get accused like we think tariffs are just like the worst sort of tax. Tariffs aren't necessarily worse than an income tax. In fact, income tax is bad for political reasons because it violates everybody's property or property rights and privacy as well. So I mean, I have no love for the income tax, but if you're going to have a tax that is a tariff, and that's all a tariff is a tax, you need something that the economy can actually respond to, adjust to, start to plan around, and not make it these totally prohibitive taxes as well, where the whole point is to raise prices, right? The whole point of a protectionist tariff, not to be confused with a revenue tariff, you want people to import stuff so that you collect more revenue. A protectionist tariff, the whole point is to increase prices to the point that people stop buying the imports, at which point you're not raising revenue tariff because people aren't buying imports. The whole point is to raise prices. And so we shouldn't be surprised at all if the cost of living and prices go up, if the real commitment is to protectionist tariffs. And then, yeah, that will worsen the economy, and that'll drive calls for lower interest rates. So there's no good real solution to this. The solution should be deregulation, right? It should make it easier to open businesses in America. They need to, the irony also that needs to be mentioned is that it is monetary policy that has driven a lot of these constant purchases of foreign goods and has created these huge trade deficits, right? If you had a actually free market economy where people could only spend in proportion to the amount of wealth that they create, then they would be limited. There would be a much more even flow in terms of exports and imports. Because in order to afford imports, they would need to produce a certain amount of goods and services. They would need to have savings. They would need to invest in capital. And only then some of that would be left over then for buying things, whether it's Chinese imports or whatever. But as the central bank has made sure has happened, people are running the U.S. government is sending out more money every year than in what people are producing, and so it's creating this inflation that allows people to consume more and more at levels that are higher than what they're actually producing. So Americans are just buying more and more stuff while they're not producing as much stuff that could be used for export or for building wealth in America. So you could actually blame monetary policy in a big way for these big trade deficits as well, but nobody's talking about that. And I expect all they're going to do is then say, hey, we want more monetary stimulus to get us out of this tariff-induced hole, when the reality is that monetary stimulus was actually driving a large part of that excess of imports.